One of the most perceptive, if somewhat ironic, endorsements of the concept of gun control comes from an individual by the name of Sammy the Bull Gravano, who was a former hitman for the Gambino crime family in New York. This is what he has to say on the subject of gun control, which I think should be referred to more properly as civilian disarmament, and I quote, "Gun control, it's the best thing you can do for crooks and gangsters. I want you to have nothing. If I'm a bad guy, I'm always going to have a gun. Safety locks? You will pull the trigger with a lock on, and I'll pull the trigger. We'll see who wins." And Mr. Gravano cut to the core of the issue of civilian disarmament, and that is this. Gangsters, whether you're talking about people in the private realm or whether you're talking about gangsters who are operating through the power of government, prefer that their prospective victims be disarmed. That's something which was documented quite extensively in this fully researched report by the group Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. It's entitled Gun Control Gateway to Tyranny. This was put out several years ago, and it demonstrates the inevitable relationship between the disarmament of civilians and mass murder of civilians by governments. Just briefly to review some of the relevant data from this study. The Soviet Union in 1929 established what we would call gun control. And from 1929 to 1953, 20 million people were slaughtered by that government. Political dissidents, for instance, people who were opposed to the regime and its policies. Turkey established gun control in 1911, and between 1915 and 1917, about 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered by that government. Communist China. It has had gun control since 1935, since before that unfortunate nation fell into the hands of the communists. And over a period of a little more than 30 years, about 20 million people were slaughtered by that government. And the most notorious example, of course, is that of National Socialist Germany, which established gun control in 1938, and from 1939 to 1945, about 13 million human beings were slaughtered. Jews, gypsies, mentally ill people, people who were considered mongrelized and thus subhuman, were systematically slaughtered by a regime in which criminals had taken control of the power of government. It's important to recognize that while civilian disarmament is something which has been achieved on numerous occasions by national governments, there is a very serious move underway right now on the part of the United Nations to bring about civilian disarmament on a global scale. On the 24th of September, the UN Security Council endorsed sweeping worldwide gun control measures, including a ban on private ownership of assault rifles. I'm reciting here from a wire service story describing that event. This is being pushed by Secretary General Kofi Annan as a way of dealing with conflicts, low-intensity conflicts around the world. The idea being that you can somehow bring about peace and stability and liberty by disarming the law-abiding, because obviously gun control only disarms those who obey the gun control laws. This is not a new development. The United Nations has been seriously pushing what they call gun control for a long, long time. Back in May of 1994, a reporter for the Associated Press by the name of Charles J. Hanley reported the following, and I quote, "So quietly that even the gun lobby hasn't noticed, the United Nations is beginning to set its sights on global gun control. The UN Disarmament Commission has adopted a working paper, a basis for future debate, that proposes tighter controls on the gun trade in the United States and other member nations as a way of combating international arms trafficking." The really interesting wrinkle to the more recent proposal is that handguns and small arms are now being referred to as weapons of mass destruction, and hence subject to arms control in the same way that nuclear weapons or chemical and biological weapons are considered the proper domain of arms control. The Washington Times back in 1994 elaborated upon the story of the UN's proposed gun control study in the following words. "The Clinton administration has agreed," once again bear in mind this is from 1994, 5 years ago, "the Clinton administration has agreed to participate in a discussion of ways for the United Nations to control the manufacture of guns and their sales to civilians. This represents the first UN effort to foster regulation of the multi-billion-dollar trade in small arms." So the objective, once again, is for the United Nations, working as a supposed global government, to impose a regime of civilian disarmament upon the world. And through the various national governments, you would see an effort incrementally and then accelerating as time goes on to do something about taking the guns out of the hands of civilians and making them, quite frankly, helpless in the face of criminals in positions of government power who would seek to take away their rights and their liberty and their lives. At about the same time, the United Nations was talking about the possibility of bringing about worldwide gun control. The Clinton administration in the United States accelerated its drive for civilian disarmament by announcing on the 9th of September of 1999 a $15 million program aimed at reducing the number of firearms that are available in the nation's public housing projects. I'm quoting here from the Washington Post. The Clinton administration would give local police departments up to about $500,000 apiece to purchase guns in and around public housing projects. This is something that is known as micro-disarmament. When the United Nations sent troops into Haiti back in 1994, one of their first priorities was to seize the guns from the anti-communists so that they could install Aristide, who was a drug-addicted communist, upon that helpless population. They went through, first of all, by sending in special forces teams to announce gun buybacks. And when the guns were not sold to the government, then they announced that they were inaugurating gun seizures. And then the third step was to have full force raids to seize the guns at bayonet point and kill those who resisted. That's what happened in Haiti. Something similar was attempted in Somalia. Here, the Clinton administration, at roughly the same time that the United Nations is talking about a worldwide effort to ban small arms, is beginning a serious drive towards gun buybacks. Now, there are two problems here. The first of which, of course, is that it's part of this three-stage strategy I just described, where you start with buying back the guns and eventually you go to the step of seizing them through main force. But the second problem here is that if you buy back guns from criminals, you're paying criminals to steal guns. You're creating a market incentive for people to go out and steal guns. Hence, you're going to be rewarding the criminal element. That's a principle that I hope people will come to understand, is that there's a natural affinity of interests between criminals in positions of government authority and criminals in the streets. It takes us back to what Sammy the Bull Gravano said about how criminals want their victims to be disarmed. There is no difference in the perspective of criminals in the streets and the perspective of criminals in the corridors of government power. Their common enemy would be the law-abiding population. Their common desire is to take away the rights and property of the law-abiding. And that's why I think it's important that rather than referring to the imposition of such controls as a police state, we start thinking of it in terms of it being a gangster state or a robber state rather than a police state. Because you're talking about robbers exercising political power over those who are law-abiding. The United Nations program for civilian disarmament and the creation of a global robbers state or a global police state follows very carefully the 1961 Freedom from War document, which was issued by our State Department, which talks about a three-stage plan for disarming the world and consolidating military power in the United Nations, and then leaving in each member state of the United Nations what they call an internal security force, which would be a centralized and militarized police state, for lack of a better term. This was promulgated in 1961 by our State Department, and it remains today, at the cusp of the 21st century, the official policy of our government and the official blueprint for the UN's drive towards civilian disarmament and the centralization of police authority at a global level. The gun control policies, as they are called, of the United Nations and of the Clinton administration are part of this unfolding design. In order to bring about the disarmament of the law-abiding, it's necessary that you alter the concept of individual rights and you insinuate into society the concept of public safety as being the highest good rather than the protection of individual rights. Our constitutional perspective is that public safety is enhanced when the law-abiding are permitted, rather not merely permitted, but are encouraged to bear arms. That's one of the most important lessons of our founding era, is that government becomes an agency of tyranny if the law-abiding segment of the population is disarmed. If you have the public safety concept being promoted by the United Nations and the Clinton administration as the prevailing doctrine, then you have to do away with the notion that people have a right and a civic responsibility to bear arms, and you suddenly find yourself in an environment in which the government decides which members of the population will be permitted the privilege of keeping and bearing arms. Now remember the example of National Socialist Germany. Gun control, or civilian disarmament in National Socialist Germany, started out as being rather selective. There were certain people who were considered to be worthy of the privilege of keeping and bearing arms. Among those people who were considered to be unfit were the Jewish population of National Socialist Germany. So you had selective disarmament. And you can see something of the same philosophy being insinuated into American society today. On September 27th, the wire services of our country were abuzz with the story of what's going on in the state of Connecticut, which is going to become the first state in our union to enact a preemptive gun seizure law. According to the Associated Press, beginning in October of 1999, and I quote, "Connecticut police will be allowed to confiscate guns from anyone determined to be an immediate danger to himself or others." Now, how would they make such a determination? I would expect that they're not going to be hiring a battery of psychics who would be able to make such a determination. They're going to be acting upon information provided to them by, among other things, informants, people who are keeping an eye on their neighbors, people who are scrutinizing their neighbors for signs of political instability or psychological instability. Implicitly, the state of Connecticut is asking its citizens to become informants on each other. And that, once again, is a concept that we see from tyrannical states throughout history. Robber states or police states, such as National Socialist Germany, where they had the block committees. Keep an eye on your neighbor, report those who show some sign of being politically nonconformist. Communist Cuba operates in the same way. Soviet Russia did in the depth of the Stalinist and Brezhnevite tyrannies. And in late 1999, after a terrorist bombing campaign erupted in Russia, we saw once again the block committees being formed in post-Soviet Russia, which isn't surprising because it's pretty much the same hapless country that it was before the supposed break with the past in 1991. So in Connecticut, dangerous people will no longer have the right to keep and bear arms. They can have that right preemptively taken from them before they commit a crime, or before they make an overt threat to commit a crime. What are the criteria that would be used to determine whether or not somebody is dangerous? They are they're very careful right now about saying how they would define exactly who would be dangerous, but there are plentiful indications that are available in the public record that a political definition of potential danger is going to be followed by state and local law enforcement agencies. I'll give you one example. I'm quoting now from the book Freedom in Chains by James Bovard. This is what he reported regarding this emerging doctrine of public safety, and I quote, "At a 1997 American Society of Criminology conference, one professor argued that among signs of hate group ideology were discussion of the Bill of Rights, especially the Second Amendment or the Federalist Papers, discussion of military oppression in the United States or elsewhere, and discussion of the framers of our government. Professor Joyce Lee Malcolm, who attended the conference session, observed that the professor was anxious to have militias classified as hate groups because then federal legislation on hate groups would apply to them. And Professor Malcolm was surprised that the proposed expansive definition of hate groups elicited no objections from the scholarly audience. If you're caught discussing the Second Amendment in public, you're a potential danger to society. And in principle, in a state such as Connecticut, that could be used to nullify your right to own firearms. This is a dreadful development, and it's perfectly compatible with this emerging robber state ideology that I'm referring to. I'll give you a second example of the same concept at work. There is a fellow, a self-anointed expert on radical right groups. I have had the opportunity to interview him. His name is John Nutter. He operates the Ohio-based Conflict Analysis Group. Mr. Nutter told me during the course of a telephone interview that he doesn't believe that there is such a thing as a left-wing hate group or a left-wing radical group. Apparently radicalism is a monopoly of the right. He puts on a seminar entitled Criminal Justice and Right-Wing Extremism in America. And the first place he held this seminar was in Oklahoma City in April of 1996. He describes in the syllabus of his materials right-wing extremism as a lightning rod for the mentally disturbed. And it threatens, that is to say right-wing extremism, threatens assassination, mass murder, and armed uprising. And so he teaches seminars for law enforcement officers across the country at both the state and local level. And he talks about warning signs of potentially dangerous human personalities. What are those warning signs? Well, he refers to militia symbols such as firearms lapel pins, bumper stickers or window decals about the New World Order, Clinton communism, or such slogans as "I fear the government that fears my gun," or "Don't tread on me" flags. You see somebody sporting a lapel of that sort or bearing a bumper sticker of that variety in his car, mark that person down as a potential terrorist, according to John Nutter, and he is catechizing law enforcement officers to this effect. He urges police officers to be wary of individuals who express, quote, excessive concern over the Waco episode, over the Randy Weaver tragedy in Idaho, or over such gun control measures as the Brady Bill. And these preoccupations can supposedly be discerned by people who have a detailed knowledge of these episodes. That's not, from Nutter's perspective, an indication that the person is a conscientious citizen and is well informed about contemporary affairs. No, that's the symptomology of a potential terrorist, and so policemen need to keep an eye on such individuals. Furthermore, he says, do you know people who speak of a loss of American sovereignty to the United Nations? Do they bring up the case of Army Specialist Michael New, who was court-martialed for refusing to wear the United Nations uniform? Do such people mention the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission? Do they seem to have an excessive fondness for the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution? Do they display an excessive commitment to the Second Amendment? Do they believe that the right of individuals to possess arms is a key to preserving individual freedom? Are they fearful of any limitations on the ownership of weaponry, etc.? These people should be marked down as potential terrorists, according to John Nutter. And once again, as the state of Connecticut has displayed, there is this developing interest in marking such people as potential terrorists and preemptively disarming them as part of this unfolding design to bring about a world that is disarmed in a civilian sense, and hence a world of people who are potential victims of government oppression. To display how this works in principle, and how this works in practice, rather, I would cite the case of Kay Stone and Jean Valance of Alamogordo, New Mexico. They're a couple of retired grandmothers who are politically active, very diligent citizens. One of them is going to college, and in late 1998, they were placed under the scrutiny of the New Mexico State Police as potential terrorists. These are once again retired grandmothers we're talking about. They were placed under the scrutiny of the New Mexico State Police because they had gone on a radio program to discuss the United Nations and the loss of sovereignty of the United States to the United Nations. There was an official of the state police who called a radio host by the name of Mike Shinneberry, who had the radio program upon which these two presumed terrorists had made their supposedly seditious remarks. And on the audio tape of that telephone call, of which I have a copy, Lieutenant Bowers of the New Mexico State Police referred to them as radicals, such as, quote, some lady in there talking about the UN and the UN treaty down at the border and how we need to check into that treaty and everything. And in response to Bowers' inquiries, the host, Mike Shinneberry, mentioned Jean Valance, who is a local activist, self-educated on issues having to do with the United Nations. And Bowers brought up the name of Kay Stone, who was the other of these two. He brought her name up, suggesting once again that he had some kind of intelligence about the fact that this individual was an activist. And he said, does Kay Stone ever get on with you guys on your radio program? And Shinneberry responded, yeah, she's been on a couple of times. And Bowers replied, okay, I figured as much. So somewhere there was this master list in the state of New Mexico of potential terrorists who were people who had, in some forum, some public forum, expressed opinions that had marked them as potential seditionists or potential terrorists. Now there was a handbook that was put together by the state of New Mexico entitled The Extremist Right, an overview. It was compiled by the Criminal Intelligence Section of the New Mexico Department of Public Safety. This is what that document had to say about the pool of potential terrorists. Quote, there is no doubt that actions by some right-wing anti-government extremists have created a new level of terrorism in the United States. The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City is the most deadly result of domestic extremist activity to date, but experts agree that it is only a matter of time before an equally or even more deadly event occurs. So who is this radical right from whom such acts of terror can be expected? This is what the document had to say. The radical right exists as a continuum from those who disagree with government but operate within the law to those who work at nothing less than the overthrow of government. These groups call themselves patriots. The patriot movement is an umbrella term used to describe previously unrelated groups who share a common distrust in the government and a willingness to see it destroyed. So we see a magic Soviet-style redefinition of a previously very worthy term, patriot. Patriot is now to be used as a functional synonym for terrorist, and the state of New Mexico, through its Department of Public Safety, was urging that definition upon the law enforcement community in New Mexico. The anti-government continuum continued the New Mexico State document. The anti-government continuum includes tax protesters, millennialists, survivalists, populists, freemen, constitutionalists are potential terrorists as well as patriots, neo-Nazis, skinheads, Klansmen, secessionists, militant abortion foes, radical environmentalists. The ties that bind these groups together, according to this document, are the common use of biblical references in the rhetoric and literature of such movements and the prevalence of conspiracy theories among them. This was the document that was being used once again by the New Mexico State Police to define who these dangerous people were, and these dangerous people were being kept under surveillance by law enforcement. In the aftermath of some of the horrible things that have happened in the summer of 1999, some of the incidents of mass murder involving firearms, some of the horrible things that have happened, such as the daycare shooting by Buford Furrow. Some of the self-appointed watchdog groups have urged that the FBI take up the burden of keeping so-called right-wing subversives under surveillance. To give you one example of this chorus, Barry Morrison, who is the regional director for the so-called Anti-Defamation League in New Jersey and in Philadelphia and Delaware, said the following thing in an August 15, 1999 op-ed column for the Philadelphia Inquirer, quote, "Various government agencies, federal, state, and local, should continue to study hate crimes and to explore and recommend both preventative and response strategies." Once again, we get back to the notion of preventive enforcement. In this regard, the U.S. Departments of Justice and Education and the Pennsylvania Human Rights Commission have done cutting-edge work. For example, the Joint Justice and Education Report Early Warning, Timely Response, A Guide to Safe Schools, is replete with sound analysis and practical suggestions to tackle the nexus of youth, violence, and hate. And of course, that deals once again with the post-Columbine idea that we have to have these paramilitary strike forces ready on a moment's notice to storm public schools, to deal with shootings in schools. And also we have to have some kind of preemptive, almost therapeutic influence by the federal government to prevent this sort of thing from happening in public schools to begin with. The time has come, continues Morrison, to rethink and re-examine the policies and practices that govern the ability of law enforcement agencies to monitor hate groups. Present guidelines practically require a smoking gun, compelling evidence that a crime has been committed or is imminent, before an active investigation is undertaken. We need to review such policies and seek zealously to strike a careful balance between security needs and First Amendment protections. In other words, we have to have more diligent political scrutiny by the central government of these right-wing extremists, according to Barry Morrison. Ruth Wedgwood of Yale University, who advises the FBI and who has been a federal prosecutor, picked up the same proposition and broadcast it to the world in an August 15th, 1999 Washington Post op-ed column. This is what she had to say. And bear in mind, Ruth Wedgwood is not some ivory tower intellectual. She's not some abstracted academic who is simply writing for the benefit of the 5 or 6 people who would review her for tenure or something of that nature. She is somebody who's not only an instructor at Yale University Law School, she's also a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a group not without influence in our political system. This is what she had to say. "Free speech and a largely unrestricted gun trade can be a heady combination for supremacist groups trawling the internet or elsewhere for recruits. We need to find a response that will not damage the traditional liberties of American society, but will keep hate groups from using them as a shelter while they swagger and intimidate to win new converts. What can we do? One useful step would be for the FBI to expand its efforts to keep watch on hate groups and be in a better position to stop crimes before they happen." You see sort of a common refrain that's emerging in these proposals I'm talking about. This will take additional manpower and resources, and Congress should supply the needed funds. Wedgwood also suggests that criminal laws concerning threatened violent acts should also be strengthened at the state level. If more than one person is involved, criminal conspiracy laws can be used, since once there is an agreement to commit a crime, any overt act, even one as trivial as purchasing a road map, can trigger prosecution even if no victim has been selected. So we have an expansion of conspiracy laws now to deal, once again, with this pool of right-wing extremists on the assumption that government now has a mandate to act preemptively to prevent crimes before they occur or before they're even planned. And then Wedgwood continues as follows. It may be possible to find a way to apply the principle of conspiracy laws to a lone plotter. That is, once a decision to commit a crime has been made, any action on that decision can trigger prosecution. So now we can have a conspiracy involving one person, according to Ruth Wedgwood. She also says that the street smarts of the Secret Service may hold a lesson here. To deter real threats to the president's life, Secret Service agents have long sought out and interviewed anyone who speaks of using violence against the president, even when the statement may have been uttered in jest or in a moment of anger. These interviews allow the agents to evaluate the threat at closer hand and let them take precautions if the threat seems serious. Are we sure that threats against racial and religious groups cannot be equally serious? The interesting implied message in that element of Ruth Wedgwood's proposal is that you should have the federal government actively seeking to intimidate in order to preempt the commission of violent acts, actively seeking to intimidate people who belong to so-called hate groups. And the term hate group, of course, is one of those politically loaded locutions that means exactly what the power elite wants it to mean, nothing more, nothing less. It could mean something today and something completely different tomorrow. But hate groups in this context almost always refer to people who want to see government reduced in size and scope, made less intrusive, made less expensive, and people who want to restore our constitutional framework. Remember what John Nutter had to say. Remember what these criminologists have to say about how if you talk excessively about the Constitution, you're the sort of a person who's a potential terrorist. Back in the era of Reconstruction, President Andrew Johnson once said, anytime you hear a man talking about the Constitution, spot him as a traitor. And apparently we have reverted to that unhappy period in our nation's history. There's another way of expanding the pool of potential lawbreakers so as to expand the scope of government's authority. And that is simply to write so many laws that nobody could possibly keep them all, so as to make all of us potential criminals. Back in March of 1993, the Wall Street Journal took note of this when it said, "We are a nation of lawbreakers. Nearly all people violate some laws, and many people run afoul of dozens of others without ever being considered or considering themselves to be lawbreakers. Accordingly, Americans are left in a state of perpetual concern for their freedoms, as laws that are often broken with impunity make it difficult for people to predict the consequences of their acts." The state of perpetual insecurity regarding one's personal liberty, one's property, is one of the symptoms of an emerging police state. That's one of the things that has characterized every tyrannical regime, once again, whether National Socialist Germany, Soviet Russia, Communist China, and so forth. The sense that you are never secure in your person and property because you're never certain whether or not you're breaking a law. And of course, ignorance of the law, we're told, is no excuse. The left-wing historian William Shirer once pointed out that when Hitler came to power in 1933, there ensued a Niagara of thousands of special decrees and laws. Even the most astute businessman was often lost, and special lawyers had to be employed to enable the firm to function. Sounds rather familiar. Anybody who's ever had to undergo the horror of tax preparation can understand exactly what it must have felt like to be a German living in that nation in 1933 when the sudden Niagara of laws ensued. In order to gauge our descent into the police state, or what I call the robber state, there are a few questions that Americans should ask themselves. To what extent has law and order been defined as controlling people rather than protecting their lives and their property? To what extent is law enforcement preoccupied with political crimes rather than offenses against persons and property? How much does the state rely upon anonymous informants or concealed agents to monitor citizens? And we've just discussed a number of very disturbing developments showing that the emerging robber state in our country is making heavy use of informants and such. And perhaps most importantly, to what extent do peaceful, moral citizens live in fear of the law enforcement agents of a society? Those are the key questions that people need to ask themselves. Just briefly, I'd like to give you a little bit of a philosophical background for the discussion of the robber state. One of the most perceptive analysts of politics in the modern era was Frédéric Bastiat, the 19th century political philosopher from France. And in spite of the fact that he was handicapped by the fact of being from France at a time after the French Revolution, he understood the American proposition of government very well. Perhaps it's because he came from that background, because he'd been exposed to the opposite, the revolutionary doctrines of the French Revolution. He came to understand the American concept of government better than many Americans. This is what he wrote in his slim but indispensable volume entitled The Law. We must remember that law is force, and that consequently the proper functions of the law cannot lawfully extend beyond functions of force. In other words, if a private citizen can use force in a certain situation, if it's moral and legal for him to do so, that defines what the state can do acting on his behalf. If I am entitled by the laws of nature and nature's God, to use Jefferson's formulation, to use force to defend my family, I can authorize the state to do the same thing. But I cannot use force to acquire somebody else's property. Therefore, the state cannot do that. The state and I are both bound by considerations of due process under the Constitutional Compact. John Locke, the British philosopher who had a great deal to do with the philosophical framework of our founding, elaborated upon the same principle, and I quote, "Since no individual acting separately can lawfully use force to destroy the rights of others, does it not logically follow that the same principle applies to government, which is the organized combination of individual forces?" Seems like a fairly straightforward proposition. We're all governed by the same laws. That is how you define a republic, which is what we were given in our Constitution. We're guaranteed a republican form of government. It does not refer to a partisan political organization. It refers to a concept in which the government and the governed are all ruled by law. And that leads us back to the concept of being anti-government extremists. What does that mean? Well, it means exactly nothing when it's applied to the so-called right wing. The right wing, the principled right wing as defined by the John Birch Society, is not anti-government. We are emphatically pro-government. Government is a good and noble and useful thing, and it is a worthwhile calling, because government is the entity entrusted with the task of protecting the rights and the liberty of the governed. What we are anti, if you will, is we're anti-statist. We are opposed to the corruption of government into a state that is no longer serving the interests of protecting the rights and property of the governed. We are emphatic supporters of the proposition that governments are necessary and useful, but when they are perverted into nothing more than organized coercion for the purpose of plunder, for the purpose of oppression, we are very much opposed to that in whatever form it might take, whether it's communism, fascism, National Socialism, or other forms of totalitarianism, or other forms of organized corruption. That is what we oppose. Furthermore, we embrace the same perspective on government that our founding fathers embraced, which was conspiratorial. It is our contention that the founding fathers of our country understood that government is organized force, and thus it is a very attractive quantity for those who wish to use force and fraud to enrich themselves illicitly at the expense of the public, which is why, by and large, politics becomes conspiratorial. There is a terrific book by Harvard professor Bernard Bailyn entitled The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. This won the Pulitzer Prize back in 1967, and I've often thought that the Pulitzer Committee didn't pay all that careful attention to the content of this book, because the content of this book, which is based upon Professor Bailyn's studies of the handbills and essays and speeches of our founding era, came away with some very unpopular conclusions about the political perspective of our founding fathers. Let me read Bailyn's summary here of the founding fathers' outlook. Quote, "The fear of a comprehensive conspiracy against liberty throughout the English-speaking world, a conspiracy believed to have been nourished in corruption, and of which it was felt oppression in America was only the most visible part, lay at the heart of the revolutionary movement." In other words, Professor Bailyn saying the same thing I just finished saying. Our founding fathers were conspiratorial in their political outlook. The Americanist perspective on free government can be summarized very briefly as follows. 1. The leaders and the citizens are all ruled by law. Americans are citizens who are governed, not subjects who are ruled. That's basic to the American perspective. 2. Citizens should be vigilant about encroachments by the government upon their liberties. James Madison in 1785 warned Americans, quote, to take alarm at the first experiment upon our liberties. The free men of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself in exercise. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. Once again, citizen vigilance is a key to the Americanist perspective on government. And the third point is a conspiratorial analysis of politics. In other words, we assume that you cannot trust people with political power. Political power is the ability to take people's property, to push them around, and sometimes to kill them. We cannot entrust that power to corrupt men. We can't entrust that power to good men, of whom there's only been one of whom we have any record. A conspiratorial perspective is the most important element, I contend, of the citizen vigilance necessary to preserve individual liberty. Now, how do you contrast government with the state? I've talked about the robber's state. Let's go back into antiquity and get a definition of what I mean by that expression. In the early 5th century, St. Augustine wrote a book called The City of God, and his perspective on the question of politics was summarized in the following way, quote, justice being taken away, what are kingdoms but vast robberies? In other words, if governments aren't compelled to serve the ends of justice, to protect the property and the rights and the liberties of the governed, all they are enormous criminal enterprises. They're devoted entirely to the business of plunder, to the business of oppression. You take justice out of the equation, all you've got is an organized mechanism of oppression. Back in 1956, Pitram Sorokin, who was a sociologist at Harvard, published the results of his study of rulers throughout history. And he came away with a rather dismal perspective on how governments are generally run. What he discovered was that, and I quote, the rulers of the states are the most criminal group in a respective population. With the limitation of their power, their criminality tends to decrease, but it remains exceptionally high in all cases. If you want to find where the criminals are, find where the power accumulates. Seems like a rather logical and reasonable proposition. And bear in mind, once again, that the word Sorokin used was states. The rulers of the states, not the rulers of the governments, not the leaders of the governments, the rulers of the states. Once again, there's that functional distinction between government and the state. In 1940, a federal court case called Redlands Foothill Groves versus Jacobs offered the following definition of that distinction. The term state, as used in political science, means the coercive force of government. Once again, the coercive force which is not tempered by or made subject to the demands of justice. I'll give you another example of this from a very good source. Harold Laski was a socialist political scientist from Britain. He taught at the London School of Economics because he was a member of the Fabian Socialist Society. That gives you an idea about his objectives and his loyalties. In 1935, Harold Laski said the following, and bear in mind that he was not criticizing the state when he said this. He was talking about its advantages. At any critical moment in the history of the state, the fact that its authority depends upon the power to coerce its opponents, to break their wills, to compel them to submission, emerges as the central fact of its nature. Once again, Harold Laski was not criticizing the state for this reason. He was simply highlighting, for the benefit of other statists, the advantages of working through the coercive power of the state to achieve their ends. Now, approaching this proposition from a completely different direction was the libertarian historian Albert J. Nock in his study entitled Our Enemy, the State. Now, he explained the critical distinction between state and government as follows. Quote, it is certainly true that the business of government is maintaining freedom and security and to secure these rights. But the state, on the contrary, is primarily concerned with injustice, and its function is to maintain a regime of injustice. The order of interest that the state reflects is not social, but purely antisocial. And those who administer it, judged by the common standard of ethics, or even the common standard of law as applied to private persons, are indistinguishable from a professional criminal class. The state is an antisocial institution, administered in the only way an antisocial institution can be administered, and by the kind of person who, in the nature of things, is best adapted to such service. And upon finishing that observation by Nock, I am led helplessly to reflect upon that cluster of felons and war criminals and human oddities that we call the Clinton administration, because I think that illustrates Knox's point perfectly. Now we have in the example of the National Socialist state an example of what happens when criminals rise from the gutter to the pinnacle of power. Back in 1933, a critic of the National Socialist movement by the name of Carmen Haidar pointed out, and I quote, "Once in power, the Nazis legalized their violence by employing it in the name of the state. This step from illegal violence to police methods is natural." And that's what we have seen in Nazi Germany, once again in communist Russia and elsewhere. And we're seeing it today in the United States to a shocking extent. The total state is our next subject. What is the total state? The total state is when the robbers have the sole control of the government, when the criminals have made that transition from being in the gutter to occupying the corridors of power. The founder of the total state is Vladimir Lenin, who created the Bolshevik state in Russia. And he offered, I think, the basic definition of the total state, or what is called totalitarianism. I quote now from Lenin. "The scientific concept of dictatorship means nothing else but this: power without limit, resting directly upon force, restrained by no laws, absolutely unrestricted by rules." Lenin's disciple Benito Mussolini, who founded that variant of the total state called fascism, offered an even tidier and more concise definition. Quote, "Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, and nothing against the state." It's the total state as defined by Mussolini and as practiced by most governments in our world, and as would be practiced by the United Nations were they in a position to do so. There was a rather remarkable parallel to Mussolini's formula for totalitarianism that was expressed in August of 1918 by an American statesman. And I quote, "We are living today in a highly organized state of socialism. The state is all, the individual is of importance only as he contributes to the welfare of the state. His property is his only as the state does not need it. He must hold his life and his possessions at the call of the state." That was a statement which was uttered on August 7th, 1918 by Bernard Baruch, who was the head of the War Industries Planning Board for Woodrow Wilson. And he's the same fellow who in 1950 said the following: "We shall have world government whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by consent or by conquest." So he's talking in terms now in 1950 that make it pretty clear that he's pursuing the total state on a global basis. Just a couple of other observations I'd like to make before hopefully wrapping up this presentation on a more positive note that have to do once again with this affinity between criminals in positions of political power and criminals who are outside of the realm of official power, street-level criminals working hand in hand with those who occupy the corridors of power. During the roughly 5 years that have intervened between the Oklahoma City bombing and late 1999, the Clinton administration has sought at every opportunity to expand the power of the central government and to militarize the expanded police power of the central government in the name of fighting terrorism. Yet in September of 1999, we saw the remarkable spectacle of Bill Clinton offering clemency to 16 members of the FALN, which is a militant terrorist group of Puerto Rican nationalists, people who seek independence for the island of Puerto Rico. The 16 clemency-eligible terrorists, according to Bill Clinton, had no ties to actual acts of terrorism, although the FALN conducted a rampage of bombings in which at least 130 episodes of terrorist bombing took place. At least 6 people were killed, scores were injured. Most of those who were injured were police officers. This is the same Bill Clinton who offered clemency to the 16 Puerto Rican terrorists, who passes up no opportunity to be photographed with policemen as a backdrop when he's announcing a new gun confiscation program. He makes very good use of policemen as a prop. But when it comes to dealing with those who have killed and maimed policemen as terrorists, Mr. Clinton is on the side of the terrorists, not on the side of the policemen. Every law enforcement agency in our country, including the FBI, every fraternal association of policemen condemned the clemency that was extended by Mr. Clinton to these 16 terrorists and accepted by 14 of them. Congressman Dan Burton points out something else that's quite interesting. Bill Clinton was trying to say, or trying to get the public to believe, that one of the reasons why he extended clemency to these terrorists is because they were not directly responsible for a single act of bombing. Well, Dan Burton points out, and I quote, "The president says that those he pardoned were not directly responsible for deaths. He expressed no such concern when he bombed the camp of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan in August of 1998. There he struck at a terrorist organization. Here he has rewarded one. Why the different standard in this case?" It's a very good question. According to papers that were obtained by the Senate, in the course of investigating Mr. Clinton's offer of clemency to the Puerto Rican terrorists, it has become clear that he took that initiative after he received a letter from Ruben Berrios Martinez on July 21st of 1999. Mr. Martinez is a leader of the militant Puerto Rican separatist movement. After he got that letter on the 21st of July, Mr. Clinton sent a letter to Sandy Berger, who is the National Security Advisor, asking, what about the prisoners? What about the 16 Puerto Rican terrorists who were being held in prison? Mr. Clinton was acting on the initiative that he got from a terrorist leader in Puerto Rico, which is a really interesting exercise of executive power on the part of somebody who was supposed to be the chief law enforcement agent of our country. After adverse publicity was generated by the clemency offer, James Kennedy, a spokesman for the White House counsel, got in touch with Michael Kelly, a columnist for the Washington Post, who had written critically of the clemency offer. And Mr. Kennedy, acting on behalf of the White House counsel, gave the Washington Post columnist Michael Kelly a collection of documents trying to illustrate that Mr. Clinton was acting out of high and noble motives by issuing clemency, granting clemency to these terrorists. One of the documents provided by the White House to the Washington Post rationalized the terror campaign by the FALN as, quote, "a just cause seeking to end colonialism, a crime against humanity." And it asserted the FALN's right under international law to use all means available. And it referred to the bombing campaign as an exercise of that supposed right with respect for human life, and took all possible measures to ensure that innocent people were not harmed in the course of the bombings. The really interesting thing that I thought of when I read that for the first time was that that smacks of the rationales that we heard for NATO's terror campaign against Yugoslavia, where you had 2,000 civilians killed. But they claimed, the head of NATO and his associates claimed, that every measure was undertaken to ensure that the bombing was proportionate and that any collateral damage to civilians was regrettable, but they were acting in harmony with international law. Well, the interesting thing here that is not mentioned in the documents that were provided by the Washington Post is the fact that the FALN 20 years ago, in August of 1979, essentially got permission from the United Nations to carry out its terror bombing campaign, which took place roughly between 1979 and 1981. It was the United Nations that gave them the shield of supposed international law to carry out their terror campaign in the United States, in which bombings were carried out and American policemen lost life and limb. Several were blinded, several were crippled. And Mr. Clinton, once again, is on the side of the United Nations and on the side of the terrorists and not on the side of the law enforcement officers in this matter. Two other really important pieces of this puzzle. Shortly before he granted clemency to the 16 Puerto Rican terrorists, Mr. Clinton released from an American prison Silvia Baraldini, who was an Italian communist who had worked with the FALN and with the Black Liberation Army, which was a radical black group back in the 1960s that specialized in street murders of American policemen. The Black Liberation Army had an MO, a modus operandi, in which they would send two of their members out to a street corner in New York or some other large city, find a beat cop who was not in the act of arresting somebody or in the act of carrying out some other specific task, but rather was maintaining a police presence on the streets. They would drive by the police officer and then they would summarily shoot him to death. This is how the Black Liberation Army worked, and Silvia Baraldini, who was serving a 40-year sentence in an American prison for her involvement in bank robberies and other acts of terrorism by black militants, was released from an American prison and sent back to Italy at the request of Massimo D'Alema, who was the Prime Minister of Italy. She was greeted, Ms. Baraldini, she was greeted in Italy as a triumphant heroine. The Communist Party of Italy was on hand in huge numbers, waving the hammer and sickle flag in great triumph at the arrival of Silvia Baraldini. Baraldini was also involved in the jailbreak of Joan Chemisard, who is now living in Cuba. And Ms. Chemisard was a member of the Black Liberation Army who was involved in many acts of terrorism, including, of course, the summary execution of American law enforcement officers. This was done very quietly by Bill Clinton shortly before he extended clemency to the 16 Puerto Rican terrorists. One other piece of the puzzle that is very significant is that at the same time Mr. Clinton was seeking to grant clemency to the 16 imprisoned terrorists, he was putting pressure on the State Department to grant a visa to Fernando Garcia Bielsa, who was a high-ranking member of the Cuban Communist Party, whose specific task it was to organize the FALN terrorists from Puerto Rico and to help them carry out their terror campaign in the United States. The visa would allow Mr. Garcia to work under diplomatic cover at the Cuban interest section on 16th Street in Washington, just a few blocks away from the White House. This is all going on at roughly the same time. What Mr. Clinton was doing, in other words, was he was helping to reconstruct one of the major domestic terrorist cells in our nation at the same time that he is centralizing and militarizing American law enforcement for the purported purpose of dealing with domestic terrorism. Now, why do I bring this up? There are two very good reasons why I bring this up. The first, once again, is to illustrate the affinity between the robbers in the government and the robbers who are outside the government. Their common enemy would be us, the law-abiding citizens. Their common objective is to deprive us of our rights and our property and our liberty. The second point I want to make here, once again, goes back to Frédéric Bastiat, the French philosopher of liberty, who in the mid-1800s once said that if you want to understand how government grows, it grows by creating the poison and the antidote in the same laboratory. And here we have Mr. Clinton helping to create, or at least to help accumulate the poison of terrorism, even as he proposes a statist remedy in the form of centralized and militarized anti-terrorism measures that would give more power to our central government. So what do we do about this state of affairs? The first and most important thing that people can do is to become aware of the principles enshrined in our Constitution, of the fact that the law enforcement powers of our central government are few and well-defined. Those that are retained by the states are numerous and indefinite, to use the formula of James Madison from Federalist Paper number 45. Read and acquaint yourself with the Constitution. Understand the nature of political power, how we have to support the notion of a government in which citizens have rights that are protected by the government. Understand the important fact that Americans are supposed to be citizens who are governed and not subjects who are ruled. Those are the basic elements of sound understanding about these issues. Understand this natural affinity that exists between criminals in the street and criminals who run the state. Now, what do you do about it when you acquire that understanding? The best thing you can do about it is to seek to multiply your influence by making others aware of what's going on and making others aware that we, as the citizens of a free country, what aspires to be a free country, have to enforce accountability on the part of those who would govern us. In a free society such as ours, it is the citizens ultimately who make the governors, the rulers, the leaders accountable. And in order to do that, you have to organize, you have to mobilize. And the best instrument for doing so is the John Birch Society, which for over 40 years has been seeking, through principled education and principled mobilization, to hold our elected leaders accountable to enforce the Constitution, to protect our rights and to maintain our sovereignty. Which is why, now more than ever, the best thing you can do if you want to preserve us from our full-scale descent into the robber state is to join the John Birch Society. These are the reasons why, now more than ever, it is important that you look seriously at membership in the John Birch Society and that you lend your time, influence, and talents to this epic undertaking and this noble endeavor.